Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm News 8 digital anchor Luke Laster here from the Wood TV live desk on this Wednesday morning. Dr. David Jesuit, he's the chair of the Central Michigan University Political Science Department and Model UN advisor. He was with us last week on the day that Russia and Ukraine, those tensions really just escalated there, and there was that initial attack on Ukraine. He's with us again here as this is something that is just developing hourly, almost by the minute here overseas. Dr. Jesuit, good morning. Thanks for taking some time. Where do we stand here right now?
Well, good morning. Thank you for inviting me. As you mentioned, the situation is fluid and it's changing fairly rapidly. It's difficult to have up-to-date information, but it looks like they're continuing to surround Kyiv. And they're prepared to probably blockade the city and shut it off from the rest of the country by surrounding it. And then I'm reading and hearing that that's about a 30-day siege of Kyiv. So despite the evidence that we've seen that Russian military forces have certainly taken innocent civilian lives, it seems that they're unwilling to just fight their way into Kyiv. I certainly hope that is the case, and because the capabilities that Russia is bringing to bear against Ukraine suggest that it would be able to, to destroy much of the city, despite the heroic opposition. But
are you surprised by that?
Surprised by some restraint, or
the restraint there?
Well, I mean, the way that this is playing out is not good for Putin, not good for Russia. And so I suppose if you had asked me before the invasion, I would have thought that things would have gone more smoothly, much like all the other so-called experts, right? I mean, the military capabilities that Russia has in the region are definitely more substantial than what Ukraine can use in defense. But there's some evidence that the morale of Russian soldiers is not great, and that the Ukrainian resistance, the morale is tremendous and heroic, and obviously that kind of difference is enormous in determining outcomes. But since it's played out poorly, I think that they are trying to be more cautious so that they don't have an even greater, let's say, catastrophe internationally than we've already seen for Russia. Of course, it's catastrophic for the Ukrainian people and a horrific tragedy for the people of Ukraine. So I guess given that things are going somewhat poorly, I'm not surprised that Russia's trying to be a little bit more cautious as they proceed with the occupation.
Now, morale is something that you can't necessarily predict on both Russia's side with it being low, and then on Ukraine's side with it being so high and kind of almost optimistic. Is that something that Putin can plan around here moving forward, and that's why we're seeing things going just so poorly?
Well, he probably, was being told that we're all ready and the troops are all, well-trained and excited. Well, I wouldn't say excited, but committed to the mission. So it probably doesn't get all the way up to the chain of command that there are some morale issues in the Russian military. That's my guess. I mean, who wants to tell Putin, oh, by the way, the people that you're sending to fight for you don't really want to fight for you? So I suspect that, and others have said this, that he's insulated from certain realities with respect to the preparedness of the Russian military. And so there are reports that he's growing increasingly frustrated and angry because of the so-called lack of progress. They expected a much faster victory, and I think they expected Ukraine to just surrender. maybe not from day one, but certainly after a week, they were hoping for anyway a fairly quick surrender. And so I do think he's frustrated. I think that's the strategy then becomes, well, let's surround Kyiv. They are taking other cities. Kharkiv, I think I heard this morning, there's bombardment there. So they are achieving some of those military objectives on the ground. And unfortunately, there are lives being lost. But I think that they'll probably be more patient and try to make the people of Kyiv surrender, essentially. So in the meantime, there are some talks going on in Belarus. I don't think they're making much progress yet. I suspect that Russia is just demanding unconditional surrender, and that Ukraine is demanding a ceasefire. So at least they're talking, and I'm not sure where that'll end up or how long it will take. But I think, yeah, Russia's probably going to try to play a little bit of a longer game right now.
So frustration usually breeds rash decisions, which Putin is no stranger to. Could we see that frustration boil over from him and maybe him stepping even further outside of the lines?
Well, I would disagree with the notion that he's been making rash decisions. I think that he is fairly calculating. And he's been planning this for a while, just as he had planned Crimea. He's had a long-term objective of restoring Russian Empire. I think, I had mentioned this previously. So I don't think that he's necessarily rash, but there are some indications in just watching the State of the Union last night. And the pre-State of the Union pundits were talking about a so-called report from Nancy Pelosi saying that Putin has cancer.
Oh,
right. This is
I had not heard that
confirmed. Yeah, this is what I'm saying. I think I was watching CBS. I click around a little bit. But you're hearing those kinds of things. Oh, Putin is frustrated. Putin. Oh, maybe as I said. They threw that out there. My jaw kind of dropped. I mean, is that right? Is that what people are thinking? Mm-hmm. And so there is that speculation that while he once was cold and calculating, that he's become somewhat of a erratic, irrational individual, and therefore much more dangerous. You can't predict what he will do if he's not acting in engaging in a rational process of decision making.
Interesting. I had not heard that report from anywhere, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it blew me away, but it was out there on a national network.
Speaking of State of the Union, were there any takeaways in terms of involvement from the United States here that may have stuck out to you from President Biden last night?
Well, I had been concerned, and maybe I mentioned that a week ago, that there wouldn't be a rally around the flag, as we say, during a time of an international crisis, and that we would just fall into the partisan camps that exist. And I think that I suppose I could say that I'm encouraged that there's bipartisan support for upholding the commitments that the United States has made to NATO allies, and upholding support for those kinds of core values that characterize U.S. foreign policy, or the notion of supporting liberal democracies over authoritarian states. I'm definitely happy to report that we saw some moments of bipartisanship over the bigger strategic policies and values that the United States purports to uphold, and support for that kind of consensus that emerged at the end of the Second World War. But there are some cracks there as well, and so everyone was wearing the colors of Ukrainian flag, and some were applauding at the right moment, and Poles support the policies that are being enacted. That is the sanctions. There's a reluctance to use military force, and Biden has said that's off the table. We won't be putting troops into Ukraine. There's bipartisan support for that. But when it comes to the blame game, there is that partisan blame game in Washington, D.C. This is, all Biden's fault. And we saw that with the Republican governor of Iowa. Her response, she started her response by essentially blaming this crisis on Biden. And so, it's not quite the post 9/11 bump at all that George Bush received, where his approval ratings jumped by about 50%, literally.
And I don't know if that's something that was a huge bump too.
Historic bump. And it was,
right.
Of course, the crisis was much greater.
Right.
I mean, it was an attack on the United States, and so I wouldn't suspect something in along those lines. But yeah, other than that, it was surprisingly pretty standard. List of his priorities domestically, and I suppose many are just glad to see that it was fairly calm. I know there was some heckling, and that's caught some headlines. I find that unfortunate that happens in a moment where there tends to be such serious and deferential treatment of our elected leaders. But then again, that's politics. Politics is not beanbag.
So I want to talk about, you mentioned them briefly there, what are the sanctions a little bit. Talking about short-term impacts and then long-term impacts. We actually have a few comments in our comment section here asking about that. Could you kind of explain what we're seeing with those and their impact on the U.S. and what we could see here longer term, depending on how long this goes on?
Well, the sanctions, sanctions are going to take time to work. So that includes, imposing sanctions on Russia, as we've seen from the United States and European allies. So there won't be any kind of immediate effects of sanctions for the most part. However, the pain will increase on Russia. I think the biggest news really was, in fact, cutting off the SWIFT payment system, which is used for international transactions, the SWIFT code. That's vital for international commerce, and putting Russia outside that system imposes some fairly substantial burdens on Russian oligarchs, and as well as any Russians who are doing any kind of international business. And so those are the kinds of smart sanctions I think that matter most. There are some surprises, for example, with Switzerland. Switzerland has, it's notorious for its banking secrecy laws. So if you're a criminal or dictator, you're hiding your money in Switzerland because nobody can get that information. And Switzerland, well, Switzerland has been historically a neutral country, and they have condemned Russia and have joined sanctions. And so, I don't think we're going to see many immediate effects longer term. As I said, I think probably increased energy prices, although I suspect that, when Biden was talking about the increasing oil supply, he's probably working hard at twisting, or let me put it more diplomatically, at encouraging Saudi Arabia and other OPEC partners to increase oil supply to offset any losses from Russia. So I think that behind the scenes, that's the pressure. Let's increase oil supply, OPEC, and so that there'll be less pain at the pump, presumably. But the prices don't necessarily reflect the actual supply and demand. There's just instability, and so a lot of what we're seeing now, short term, is just uncertainty and instability about what's the next step. And and even though oil prices might be going up, I suspect that the response will be an increase in supply and things should stabilize. I certainly hope so. I don't think we've seen the kind of sanctions yet that will, in my mind, have a substantial impact on the American economy or American people outside the uncertainty about oil.
And kind of speaking of next steps here, it was one of those things where Putin kind of imagined that they would just step into Ukraine and not have the issues that they're facing here. By this time next week, any idea of where maybe we could see ourselves or see this development, not ourselves?
Well, I've said from the beginning, probably looking at an insurgency in Ukraine that'll, we're talking 5-10 years down the road. Now I'm hearing others saying even longer than that. I suspect, and I suppose, I hope I'm wrong, but eventually Ukraine will. Kyiv will fall. It'll be occupied. There'll be some kind of ceasefire. I think it's going to take longer than a week. But then there will be a continued insurgency that will go on for years and years. I don't think Putin's just going to walk away at this point. But I don't think that he is going to continue. I don't think he wants to continue sustained military operations. And so we'll probably be about where we are, with some exceptions, like Kyiv may be surrounded and a week from now. But I'm looking at this at the longer term, from a longer term perspective. This is not just a crisis that's going to be over in a week.
Dr. Jesuit, we appreciate your time. Is there anything else that you'd like to put out there here?
Well, I think some of what needs to be said has to be looking at it from Russia's perspective, and so by that I mean that I don't like to see, personally speaking, as this the way that we personalize these conflicts, and so that it's Putin versus Biden, for example, or Putin versus Zelensky, and we do that all the time historically, and it makes sense, but. From Russia's perspective, I would say that they do have some strategic interest in what happens in Ukraine. We have to accept that. Just as the United States has a strategic interest in our neighbors in Canada and Mexico, it's reasonable that Russia would have some concern about what's happening in Ukraine as their neighbor, and so that means that it's not. We don't have to look at Putin as being this irrational, evil dictator for being concerned about Ukraine joining NATO. And if you try to give yourself some perspective, imagine if Canada were to join an alliance with the People's Republic of China. I hate analogies, but they have their use, and I think that Americans would be fairly upset and be worried if that were to occur. And so some Russian nationalists are worried, are concerned. They don't trust the United States and the Western allies, and so they saw this as many perceive that as a threat. Now, of course, that does not justify what Putin is doing. You can have a strategic interest and concern, but that doesn't mean that you invade your neighbor. And that is what is certainly unjustified and wrong. But I hope that as they consider moving toward some resolution, that there is some serious consideration given to the legitimate security interests that Russia has, and I know that any kind of long-term solution will have to take that into account.
Dr. Jesuit, again, thank you for taking the time here to chat with us. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a link attached to the stream, takes you over to woodtv.com. If you tuned in late or maybe are just now tuning in, we've been chatting here for about 20 minutes or so. You'll be able to catch that full conversation there. Dr. Jesuit, if you can hold on the line here for just a moment, I'm going to wrap up our stream here. And ladies and gentlemen, again, this has been a look at the Wood TV Live Desk. I'm News 8 digital anchor Luke Laster. Have a great afternoon. And again, this full conversation over on woodtv.com. We'll see you around, folks. Thanks for watching.
Thanks.